what's your basic definition to explain to somebody when they ask, what is the Satanic Panic? How would you summarize it?
Right. I mean, I would summarize it as it was the belief that there was a cabal of Satanists that was international, underground, deeply networked and connected with one another, that were conspiring together to abuse children, get them hooked on drugs, use them for pornographic purposes. I mean, in cases like there's lots of these stories of like impregnate them and then take their children or their fetuses and sacrifice them to say, like, the stories get really wild and crazy. But all of that, like that core idea of there's a national network, an international network of Satanists that are doing these things and they're working in schools and daycares and churches and different places. It took hold in a profound way, and it was taken very, very seriously. And you can go back and you can look at the news. I mean, lots of daytime talk show was covering this stuff, but so was CNN, so was 60 Minutes, so was respectable stuff on PBS, the New York Times, Washington Post.
As I recall,
they really believed it was happening.
It was just kind of assumed that there are Satanists and they are up to no good and they're doing awful things. The scale might be debated, but nobody was really questioning whether or not it was real.
Right.
All right. So here's
here's the other thing that I always say real quick. The other thing I always say is that if you were a child of the 80s, and you were an evangelical child of the 80s in particular, your mom was nervous about everything from the Smurfs to the Magic 8 Ball to Dungeons and Dragons to the Gummy Bears TV show on Saturday mornings. Like anything that had anything to do with magic, there was this anxiety, there was this paranoia that this stuff was going to like seep in, get under your subconscious, and essentially the entertainment itself was going to groom you to get you ready. So when the cabal came knocking at the door, you were ready to, sign up or whatever.
Mike Warkey is one of the guys that you highlight in one of the episodes. I didn't know him because he was, I think, big in the 70s, which was a little bit before I was.
Well, his heyday was the 80s, actually.
Was it really?
So, yeah.
I don't know why. I never encountered it. But he explained Mike Warkey and other people you would label as hucksters that utilize this trend to scare a lot of people and make a lot of money.
Yeah. So Warkey first arrives on the scene in 1970. I think his first kind of like real ministry experience was around 1971, 1972. And he kind of comes out of, at least sort of culturally, he comes out of the Jesus People movement. He's attached to some charismatic revivalist evangelist types in Southern California. And he's got this testimony. He's got this wild testimony about how he was involved in the Church of Satan, and he had a radical conversion. 1970, I believe it was 1973, he publishes his memoir, which is called The Satan Seller, in which he talks about how significant it was. He was a high priest in the Church of Satan. He had sex slaves. He was a drug dealer. He, all this stuff. I mean, intense stuff. He was jet setting around the world with other rich and famous Satanists and involved in all this conspiratorial stuff and involved in child sacrifice and, witnessing all this horrible stuff. And, he puts the book out and the book does okay. But when he really explodes is actually 1976. 1976, he puts out his first comedy album. And from 76 to 1993...
That's what I would expect from a former Satanist to do stand-up. Yeah.
And the thing you got to understand about Warkey, like, Warkey is this, like, he looks kind of like Gallagher. Like, he's got this like goofy look about him. He wears these Coke bottle glasses. He's got the mullet. He dresses funky. And, what he does is he shares this crazy testimony, and he's very, like, he's funny. Like, he's not a great stand-up comedian, but he is a compelling character, and he's funny, and he gets a crowd going. But what he does, if you listen to the albums, like what he does is this interesting thing where he kind of oscillates between this very vulnerable testimony of, man, Jesus can love me like he can love anybody, this radical testimony of the horrible things he saw and did as a Satanist, and then the comedy, the jokes, the funny stories, the things about his parents, the things about growing up. Like he was good. He knew how to kind of work the angles on the thing. So he was the best-selling spoken word artist for Word Records in the period that he was out there. Sold millions of records, unbelievable number of tickets, and and then sort of outside of like the Christian subculture, he was a guy who would show up on Larry King whenever Satanism was in the news. He would show up on talk shows. Oprah had him on. Donahue had him on. Like he was a prominent cultural figure and treated as an expert on Satanism in the United States.
So he's kind of an evangelist for warning people about the reality and dangers of Satanism.
Exactly. And then in 1993, two journalists, Mike Hertenstein and John Trott, got a note from their editor at Cornerstone Magazine that said, hey, maybe it's time to look into the Warkey story. Because there had been rumors for years.
After 20 years, they're finally looking into the story. Maybe we should check this out. Okay.
Yeah, there had been rumors for a long time about his relationships with women, things happening on the road, alcohol consumption, like all these kinds of things that were just kind of like, what's really going on? He was raising all this money for, this like center for recovering Satanists in Wilmore, Kentucky. And they look into it and they're like, the story they published basically goes, so when it comes to evidence for him ever having been involved in Satanism whatsoever, it essentially boils down to, we think maybe he played with a Ouija board once his freshman year of college. And that's about as much as we've got, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Like it's literally like, aside from that, there's basically no one who knew him at the time that would have ever said like he was a Satanist.
Okay. So that leads me to another level of this whole thing that we need to talk about. Someone like that comes along with this crazy story that, for whatever reason, and took 20 years for anybody to really investigate and look into. I have to think it's because as he went about telling this story, there were thousands, millions of people who simply wanted it to be true.
Exactly.
There was something about these stories, not just his, about all the Satanism, about the child abduction stories, the abuse, the cultic kind of stuff. Why do you think so many people in the church wanted these stories to be true to the point where they never even really investigated whether they were? What was it?
Yeah.
What was it offering to people or supplying to people that they were just ready to gobble up?
So what I think it actually boils down to is that what a moral panic actually does is provide a pressure release for our anxieties. So a parallel story, and this is something that we'll talk about later in the series, like in the next couple episodes, a parallel story to all of this is that there was kind of a faux pas on talking about child abuse for most of Western history until the 1960s. And then 1960s, 1970s, there becomes this awareness of like, oh, there's this thing where kids are abused in homes and they're abused by their parents, right? And then in the 1980s, you start to find, because it becomes acceptable to like talk about domestic abuse, talk about child abuse, the discussions about sexual abuse really start to begin then for the first time. There's not a lot of discussion of child sexual abuse before then as a prominent phenomenon. And now these days we know that this happens a lot. So if you put yourself in the place of people in positions of power and influence, Christian leaders in positions of power and influence, and you start hearing, like, the zeitgeist is changing and you're hearing more about child sexual abuse than you've ever heard before in your life. What's easy? Like, what's easier to believe with your own conscience? Is it easier to believe that like I think it's something like 1 in 8 of the people in your pews or families in your pews have experienced some kind of sexual abuse in the home? Or is it easier to believe, no, it's an externalized problem. There's a cabal of Satanists. It's happening out there, and they are out to get your kids, and we have to figure out how to declare war on them and protect our kids, right? I think it's actually comforting in a very weird, convoluted way to be able to say the problems, the predatory behavior that's coming after our children is this evil cabal of Satanists that want to like sacrifice cats and drink their blood and do this other stuff and, you know, torture our children while they're at it. Rather than like the much more uncomfortable thing, which is like most sexual abuse in the home happens because of stepfathers and, you know, stepbrothers. And, you know, it's often somebody whose neighbors would have said, "Oh, I never would have suspected it. He was a nice guy," like that kind of thing.
I mean, you open the whole series with an examination of Josh Dugard from the famous Dugard family in Arkansas, and all the, was it 19 kids and counting or something? And you look at Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson in the SBC, and in all these stories that we discover later, there was sexual abuse going on. These are communities or churches or family stories that made a big deal out of presenting the big bad culture. The evil that's out there is out to get us. All the while, the real evil was inside their own tent, but they weren't able to see it or wouldn't acknowledge it because they had an us versus them framing.